April 12, 1945. The town of Weimar, Germany, lay beneath a cold spring rain that turned the rubble-strewn streets into rivers of grey mud. Corporal James McAllister of the 761st Tank Battalion crouched beside his medical kit in what remained of a pharmacy, listening to the distant rumble of artillery that echoed through the skeletal remains of buildings. The air smelled of wet stone smoke and something else he had learned to recognize over the past months, the particular odor of a city in defeat. Around him, soldiers from the all-black unit that had fought its way across France and into the heart of Germany prepared for what they believed would be another day of treating their wounded brothers, while the local population cowered in cellars, seeing them as liberators they neither wanted nor trusted. The irony was not lost on James. They had traveled thousands of miles to free people who often looked at them with more fear than gratitude, while back home in America, they could not sit at the same lunch counters as white citizens. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them knew was that in the next 72 hours, one medic's decision to honor his oath would challenge everything both sides believed about humanity in wartime, creating ripples that would reach far beyond the smoking ruins of a defeated nation. It would become a story that transcended military records and found its way into the hearts of people on both sides of the former conflict, a testament to the possibility of compassion even in the darkest circumstances. James McAllister had taken his medic's oath 2 years earlier at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, in a segregated training facility where black soldiers learned to save lives, while being reminded daily that in their own country they were considered second-class citizens. The training had been rigorous and unforgiving. They learned to treat gunshot wounds, burns, fractures, and shock. They practiced battlefield triage until they could assess casualties in seconds. They memorized the locations of major arteries and pressure points. They learned to work in darkness, in cold, under fire, with inadequate supplies. And through it all, they endured the peculiar humiliation of being trained to die for a country that refused them basic dignity. The son of a doctor from Philadelphia, James had grown up in a world of contradictions. His father, Dr. Samuel McAllister, had established a medical practice that served the black community primarily, but which also treated white patients who came seeking quality care regardless of the physician's race. Their home on the edge of a respectable neighborhood was comfortable but not ostentatious. James had attended good schools, had been encouraged to read widely, had been raised to believe that education and character could overcome prejudice. But his father had also warned him about the world beyond their middle-class enclave, a world where the color of his skin would define him before his character ever could. Dr. McAllister had told James stories of being refused service at restaurants, of being stopped by police for no reason, of watching less qualified white physicians receive opportunities he was denied. Yet despite these experiences, or perhaps because of them, Dr. McAllister had instilled in James a deep commitment to the principle that healing recognized no boundaries of race, class, or nationality. James remembered a particular evening when he was 16, sitting in his father's study while rain drummed against the windows. His father had just returned from treating a white family whose regular physician had refused a house call. The father of that family had been seriously ill, and Dr. McAllister had spent hours stabilizing him, likely saving his life. When James asked why his father would help people who probably would not have helped them in return, Dr. McAllister had looked at him with tired but determined eyes and said something James never forgot. He said that they could not control how others treated them, but they could control how they treated others. He said that the oath he had taken was not conditional on reciprocity. It was a commitment to see humanity in everyone, especially when others failed to see it in him. The 761st Tank Battalion, known unofficially as the Black Panthers, had landed in France in October of 1944. The crossing had been miserable, with men packed into transport ships that rolled and pitched in autumn storms. Many had never seen an ocean before. James had spent much of the voyage treating seasickness and trying to keep spirits up among soldiers who were leaving America for the first time, heading towards something none of them could fully imagine. They had arrived to find a theater of operations that was both more organized and more chaotic than training had prepared them for. The systematic brutality of mechanized conflict, The noise that never stopped, the way mud got into everything, the cold that settled into bones and would not leave. They had been attached to various white infantry divisions, and the reception had been mixed. Some white soldiers were openly hostile, refusing to share foxholes or equipment. Others were indifferent, viewing the Black Panthers as just another unit in the vast machine of military organization. A few, particularly those who had seen the battalion in action, developed genuine respect. By the time they reached Germany, in April of '45, James had seen enough wounded men to fill a cemetery 10 times over. He had held dying soldiers as they called for their mothers, in a dozen different accents. He had written letters to families he would never meet, carefully crafting words to soften unbearable news. He had learned to function on 2 hours of sleep and cold rations. He had developed the medic's terrible skill of emotional compartmentalization, the ability to care deeply, while also maintaining enough distance to function when caring might paralyze. There was Private Marcus Johnson from Chicago, who had taken shrapnel to the abdomen and had known he was dying. James had stayed with him, administering morphine and holding his hand, while Marcus talked about his daughter, who was 3 years old and whom he would never see grow up. There was Sergeant David Williams from Tennessee, who had been burned when his tank was hit, and who had asked James to write to his mother and tell her he had not suffered. James had written the letter, had lied about the suffering because some truths served no purpose. There was Corporal Thomas Green from New York, who had survived every major engagement only to step on a mine during what should have been a routine patrol. James had arrived within moments, had worked frantically to stop the bleeding, but the damage had been too extensive. Thomas's last words had been to thank James for trying, an act of grace that haunted James more than the failures themselves. Each loss had marked him, had added weight to the burden he carried. But each loss had also deepened his commitment to his oath, had reinforced his determination that where life could be preserved or suffering eased, he would do everything in his power to make it so. He had learned that being a medic was not just about medical skill, though that was essential. It was about bearing witness to people's final moments with enough strength that they did not have to face death completely alone. It was about holding space for fear and pain, while maintaining enough composure to do what needed to be done. The other medic in his squad was Private Eugene Washington from Alabama, a quiet man with gentle eyes and hands that moved with remarkable precision. Eugene had been a veterinarian before the conflict, working mostly with farm animals in rural communities where professional medical care for livestock was rare and precious. He had learned to diagnose by observation, to treat with limited supplies, and to make life and death decisions quickly. These skills had translated remarkably well to battlefield medicine. Eugene and James had developed a partnership built on mutual respect and complementary strengths. James had better theoretical knowledge from his upbringing around his father's medical practice, while Eugene had an intuitive understanding of anatomy and a calm presence that could soothe even the most frightened wounded soldier. They communicated with few words, each often knowing what the other needed before it was requested. In the chaos of treating casualties under fire, this wordless coordination had saved lives. They had discovered a shared love of jazz music during long night watches, and they would sometimes hum melodies to each other while working, a small reminder of normalcy in the midst of hell. Eugene's favorite was Duke Ellington, while James preferred Billie Holiday. They had debated the relative merits of different artists during quiet moments, arguments that felt absurdly normal given their circumstances and which were therefore precious beyond measure. Eugene rarely spoke about his family, but James knew he had left behind a wife named Dorothy and 2 children, a boy and a girl. Eugene carried a photograph that was creased and faded from constant handling, showing Dorothy holding the children on the front porch of a modest house. Sometimes, when conditions allowed, Eugene would write letters home, his usually steady hands trembling slightly as he tried to convey love and reassurance while omitting the truth of what they endured daily. The friendship between James and Eugene represented something significant in the context of the 761st. They came from different regions, different backgrounds within the Black American experience. James's urban, middle-class upbringing was worlds apart from Eugene's rural southern roots, yet the military had brought them together, and in the crucible of shared purpose and shared danger, They had become brothers in ways that transcended their differences. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco who served as their squad leader, had told them that morning that the town was mostly secure. The German forces in the area had largely withdrawn or surrendered, leaving behind a population of mostly elderly citizens, women and children. The American advance had been so rapid that many had not fled, trapped between the retreating German military and the incoming forces. Lieutenant Morrison, their white commanding officer from the 3rd Army Medical Corps, had briefed all medical personnel the previous evening. The priority, he had made clear, was treating American soldiers. Resources were limited. German civilians would be helped only after all Allied personnel were stabilized. Morrison was not a cruel man, but he was a practical one, and in his calculation, the enemy was still the enemy, even in defeat. James understood the logic, but something in him resisted the coldness of it. His father had treated everyone who came through his door, regardless of who they were. Medicine, his father had always said, recognized no borders, no races, no politics, only suffering and the attempt to alleviate it. The rain intensified as James and Eugene moved through the town with a small patrol, checking buildings for holdouts and wounded. Most structures were damaged to varying degrees. The bombing campaigns of the past months had left few buildings untouched. Civilians peered from behind broken windows, their faces pale and frightened. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. Old men watched with hollow eyes that had seen too much. Sergeant Chen led them down Schillerstrasse, a street named after the German poet, now barely recognizable under the destruction. Halfway down the block, they heard it. A sound that every medic learned to recognize instantly, the labored, wet breathing that indicated serious respiratory distress. The sound came from a partially collapsed building that had once been an apartment house. The front wall had caved in, exposing the interior rooms like a grotesque dollhouse. Eugene looked at James, and without speaking, both moved toward the sound. Sergeant Chen called after them to be careful, watching the ruins for any sign of danger. They found her on the 2nd floor in what had been a modest living room. The approach had been treacherous, climbing over piles of masonry and splintered wood, testing each foothold carefully, lest the unstable structure collapse further. The walls that remained standing showed evidence of a life interrupted. Wallpaper with a faded floral pattern, a watercolor painting somehow still hanging askew. A clock stopped at 10:27. She was trapped beneath a fallen beam that had crushed her chest, a massive piece of timber that must have been part of the building's main support structure. The beam was easily as thick as a man's torso, and the force of its fall had driven it down onto her with devastating effect. Her graying hair was matted with dust and blood, spreading in a dark halo around her head. Her breathing came in shallow, painful gasps, each one accompanied by a wet, rattling sound that James recognized immediately as pulmonary edema. Her lungs were filling with fluid. Her skin had taken on a dusky, blue-tinged pallor, the unmistakable sign of severe oxygen deprivation. Her lips were distinctly cyanotic, her fingers, protruding from beneath the beam, twitched occasionally in involuntary movements. Beside her lay a photograph, partially torn and soaked with water from the rain that seeped through the broken roof. It showed a younger version of herself with 2 children, a boy and a girl who could not have been more than 8 or 10 years old in the image, and a man in civilian clothes, presumably her husband. They were posed in front of a tree, sunlight dappling through leaves, all of them smiling with the unself-conscious happiness of people who believed their world was secure. James knelt beside her immediately, his hands already moving through the assessment he had performed hundreds of times, pulse rapid and thready at the carotid artery, pupils reactive but sluggish, skin cold and clammy, respiratory rate approximately 30 breaths per minute, shallow and labored. Obvious chest trauma with probable multiple rib fractures, flail chest segment visible on the right side, and almost certainly hemothorax or pneumothorax, possibly both. He gently palpated the areas he could reach, feeling for other injuries. Her right arm appeared broken, bent at an unnatural angle at the mid-forearm. There might be pelvic fractures as well, though the beam made full assessment impossible. The amount of blood soaking into the debris around her suggested internal hemorrhaging. She opened her eyes and looked at him. For a long moment, neither moved. James saw her register his face, his uniform, his identity. He watched her eyes widen slightly, a flash of fear or surprise, or perhaps both. The German population had been subjected to intense propaganda about what would happen when enemy forces arrived, particularly regarding black soldiers. She had every reason to expect the worst from him. But then something shifted in her expression. Perhaps it was the gentleness of his examination. Perhaps it was the medical kit open beside him, the universally recognizable tools of healing laid out with care. Perhaps it was simply desperation, overriding fear. Her expression changed from terror to a desperate, pleading hope, the look of someone drowning who sees a lifeline, however unlikely. She whispered in German, her voice barely audible, asking for water. Her tongue moved slowly across her cracked lips. James understood enough German to comprehend the request. He had picked up a working knowledge of the language during the months of advancing through German territory, learning from prisoners, from captured documents, from the necessity of communication in occupied areas. Eugene had moved to the other side, examining the beam. He looked at James and shook his head slightly. The beam was immovable without equipment they did not have. More critically, even if they could lift it, the sudden release of pressure would likely cause immediate hemorrhage. The woman was trapped in the cruelest way imaginable, held alive by the very thing that was ending her life. Sergeant Chen appeared in the doorway, his boots crunching on broken glass. He was a compact, muscular man from San Francisco, the son of immigrants who had faced their own share of discrimination and who understood viscerally what it meant to be viewed as perpetually foreign in one's own country. Chen had proven himself an exceptional leader, courageous under fire and fair-minded in a military structure that often was neither. He assessed the situation with a soldier's practiced eye, taking in the beam, the woman's condition and the medical equipment already spread out beside James. His face remained neutral, but James could read the conflict in his eyes. Chen was bound by orders and military protocol, but he was also a man who valued integrity and who had learned to recognize moral clarity when he saw it. Chen spoke softly but firmly, telling them that they needed to move on. There were reports of American wounded 3 blocks over, soldiers from their own unit who needed medical attention. A patrol had encountered resistance from a small group of holdouts, and there were casualties. The priority was clear, established by command and reinforced by every regulation in the military medical manual. Eugene stood frozen, looking between James and Chen, caught in the terrible space between duty and conscience. James looked up at Chen, and in that moment, something in his face made the sergeant pause. It was not defiance, not rebellion against authority. It was something deeper and more fundamental. It was the look of a man who had found the line he could not cross, who had discovered the point where orders and regulations ceased to hold weight against something more essential. James said, his voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath it, that he had taken an oath. He was not leaving. The simplicity of the statement carried tremendous weight. Not "I refuse to leave," which would have been insubordination. Not "I think we should stay," which would have been a suggestion open to debate. Simply, "I took an oath. I am not leaving." A statement of fact about his identity and his commitments. Chen studied him for a long moment. The sergeant was a man who had faced his own crucibles of choice, who understood that there were moments when the rules humanity created came into conflict with the principles that made humanity worth defending. He had seen James work for months, had watched him treat wounded men with skill and compassion, had never once questioned his courage or his dedication. Finally, Chen nodded slowly, a gesture that conveyed both acceptance and a kind of respect. He said he would give James 30 minutes before he would have to report his position to Lieutenant Morrison. It was not permission exactly, but it was space. It was an acknowledgement that some choices had to be made individually, that leadership sometimes meant allowing people to follow their conscience, even when it complicated the chain of command. After Chen left, Eugene remained. He did not speak for a moment, his internal struggle visible in the tension of his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched. He had a wife and children to return to. He had orders to follow. He had every practical reason to leave with Sergeant Chen and attend to American casualties. But Eugene also had a code, one he had learned not from military training, but from years of caring for animals in rural Alabama, from the simple principle that suffering demanded response regardless of whose suffering it was. He looked at James and then at the woman, and then he opened his own medical kit. He said nothing, but his actions spoke with absolute clarity. They would do what they could together. James administered morphine first, a precious syringe from his limited supply. Each medic carried a specific number of these small, single-use injectors, and using one on a German civilian would be noted in his supplies log, would require explanation. But the morphine was essential, not just for pain relief, but to reduce the respiratory distress that came with the terror of suffocation. He injected it carefully into her upper arm, and within moments he saw her features begin to relax slightly, the lines of agony softening though not disappearing. He found a relatively clean cloth among the debris, shook it out carefully, and dampened it with water from his canteen. Military canteens held precious water, rationed carefully, but James did not hesitate. He placed the damp cloth to her lips, and she drank weakly, each swallow clearly painful but desperately needed. Her throat must have been parched, probably from hours of crying out for help that did not come. Eugene worked on clearing debris from around her, not in any hope of freeing her, but to make her more comfortable in whatever time remained. He moved pieces of plaster and wood with careful hands, creating a small clear space. He found a pillow that had somehow survived relatively intact, probably blown into the room from an adjoining space, and he gently positioned it beneath her head, elevating her slightly to ease her breathing. As they worked, James felt the weight of what they were doing settle over him. This was not saving a life. He could not save her. Even if they could lift the beam, which they could not without equipment and personnel they did not have, the sudden release of pressure would cause massive hemorrhaging. She would bleed out in moments. The beam was simultaneously killing her and keeping her alive long enough to die slowly. What they were doing was bearing witness. They were ensuring that she would not die alone and terrified. They were offering dignity to someone who had every reason to expect none from them. In a world that had become inhuman, they were insisting on humanity. The woman began to speak, her words coming in broken gasps between labored breaths. James listened carefully, piecing together her story from fragments of German and the context of her gestures. Her name was Margareta Fischer. She had been a teacher before the conflict, teaching literature to children in this very town. She spoke of Goethe and Schiller, whose works she had taught her students, trying to instill in them a love of language and beauty, even as the world around them coarsened. Her husband had been taken by the military 4 years ago, conscripted like millions of others, and sent to the Eastern Front. She had received regular letters for the first year, then sporadic ones, then nothing for over a year. She did not know if he was alive or dead, but in her heart she believed he was gone. The Eastern Front had consumed men like a furnace, and very few returned. Her son, Klaus, had been drafted at 17. He had been a gentle boy, she said, who loved music and wanted to be a teacher like his mother. The military had transformed him into something else. He had returned once on leave, and she barely recognized him. He was gaunt and hollow-eyed, jumping at loud sounds, unable to meet her gaze. He had stayed 3 days, sleeping poorly and eating little, and had said almost nothing about his experiences. Then he had disappeared back into the great machine of conflict, and she had not heard from him since. He was 19 now, if he still lived. Her daughter Anna had been fortunate. She had fallen in love with a Swiss man before the conflict intensified, and they had married quickly, and she had moved to Switzerland. At least one of her children had escaped, was safe in a neutral country. This knowledge brought Margaret comfort, even as she lay dying. James found himself telling her about his own mother, Sarah McAllister, a woman who had worked as a nurse in Philadelphia, assisting her husband in his medical practice, and sometimes taking on cases herself when Dr. McAllister was overwhelmed. His mother had taught him that healing was not just a profession, but a calling, that those who had the ability to alleviate suffering had an obligation to do so. He told Margaret about growing up in a household where medicine was discussed at the dinner table, where he had learned anatomy from his father's textbooks, where he had sometimes accompanied his parents on house calls and watched them work. He spoke slowly in his halting German, supplemented with English words when his vocabulary failed, and she seemed to understand. her eyes focusing on him with unexpected clarity. Eugene, listening quietly while he continued to make small adjustments to make her more comfortable, added his own story. His mother had taught him to care for animals, he said, because in rural Alabama, a veterinarian was essential to the community's survival. Livestock meant livelihood, and someone who could keep animals healthy and treat their injuries was valued. He had learned that all life deserved compassion, that pain was pain regardless of species, and that the ability to heal carried with it a responsibility. The irony of the moment was profound and was not lost on any of them. Two Black American soldiers, men who had fought across an ocean to defeat her nation, men who belonged to a race that had been systematically degraded by both American society and by the propaganda of the German regime they had fought against, now sitting vigil as she died, offering comfort that transcended every boundary of uniform and nationality, race and politics. Margaret asked James a question that struck him with unexpected force. She asked, her voice barely a whisper, if he hated her, if he hated all Germans. Her eyes searched his face, looking for truth. James considered this carefully before responding. He told her that he had indeed seen terrible things, that soldiers from her nation had fought fiercely and caused immense suffering. He told her that he had treated men burned by flamethrowers, shredded by artillery, broken by explosives. He told her that he had held dying soldiers who called for mothers who would never hold them again. But he also told her that he had learned something crucial during his time in the conflict. Hate, he said, was a burden too heavy to carry. It consumed energy that was needed for other things. It distorted judgment and corroded the soul. What he felt was not hate, but rather a profound sadness for all the waste and destruction, for all the lives broken by decisions made by men in power who would never know the names of those who suffered, who would sleep comfortably while millions died implementing their visions. He told her that he had learned to distinguish between fighting a military force and hating the individual people who comprised it. The former was sometimes necessary, the latter was always corrosive. She nodded slowly, tears tracing lines through the dust on her face, leaving clean trails down her cheeks. She told him, her voice trembling with emotion and pain, that she had tried to teach her students that every person had intrinsic value, that education was meant to broaden understanding and deepen empathy, not to narrow perspective and reinforce prejudice. But then, she said, the darkness had come. The regime that had twisted everything good and decent in her culture, that had taken the proud traditions of German philosophy and literature and art and perverted them into justifications for horror. She had watched her country descend into collective madness, had seen neighbor turn against neighbor, had witnessed the systematic dismantling of human decency in the name of ideology, and she had been powerless to stop it, she said. She was one teacher in one small town, trying to preserve small spaces of sanity and humanity in an ocean of propaganda and fear. She had taught Schiller's ideals of human dignity. She had assigned essays on tolerance and critical thinking. She had tried to model for her students that there were values beyond obedience, principles beyond nationalism. But it had not been enough. The current was too strong, the machinery too powerful. She had saved perhaps a few of her students from complete indoctrination, but she could not save her country, could not even save her own family from being consumed by the thing they were living through. James understood her meaning without her elaborating. Not all who lived under a terrible government believed in its principles, but they were carried along nonetheless, caught in currents too powerful for individuals to resist. The distinction between people and regimes, between individual moral actors and systems of power, was crucial, but often lost in the broad brush of collective judgment. She told him that she had tried to live according to her conscience, that she had done small acts of kindness where she could, that she had refused to participate in the worst excesses, even when such refusal brought suspicion upon her. It was not enough, she knew. She should have done more, risked more, resisted more openly. But fear was a powerful force, and she had children to protect. And the choices available to her had all been degrees of compromise. James listened, and as he did, he thought about his own country, about the segregation and discrimination he had lived with his entire life. He thought about the contradiction of fighting for freedom abroad while being denied it at home. He thought about his father's stories of indignities suffered, of talents wasted, Of potential crushed beneath the weight of systemic prejudice. And he understood, perhaps more deeply than many of his fellow soldiers could, that systems of oppression were complex, that people living within them made impossible choices, that moral purity was a luxury few could afford when daily survival was at stake. This understanding did not excuse complicity, but it complicated simplistic judgments about guilt and innocence. As the minutes passed, word spread through the 761st Tank Battalion about what Corporal McAllister was doing. The story traveled through the informal networks that existed in any military unit, passed from squad to squad, building to building. Soldiers who heard it had different reactions. Some were puzzled, questioning why a medic would waste time on an enemy civilian. Some were indifferent, seeing it as James's business and none of their concern. But others felt something stir in them, a recognition of something significant happening, and they began to make their way to the ruined building on Schillerstrasse. They came quietly, these soldiers, entering the damaged structure carefully and gathering in the room where James and Eugene kept their vigil. They were black soldiers from across America, carrying with them the diverse experiences of the African-American community. There were men from the urban north and the rural south, from families that had achieved some measure of comfort, and from families that struggled with grinding poverty. They wore the same uniform, but they came from 100 different Americas. Private Thomas Wright from Georgia arrived first after word reached his position. Thomas was a massive man, built like a football player, which he had been before the conflict. He had grown up picking cotton in the summers to help his family make ends meet, had won a scholarship to a small college, had been on track to a professional career when he was drafted. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene, and then quietly entered. He removed his helmet respectfully, as one might in a church, and he brought with him a blanket from his own pack. He handed it to Eugene without a word, and Eugene carefully draped it over Margaret, providing a small measure of warmth and dignity. Corporal David Johnson from Michigan came next. David had studied theology before being drafted, had been planning to become a minister like his grandfather. He had a deep, resonant voice that had led many prayer services for the men of the battalion, finding ways to offer spiritual comfort in circumstances that seemed to mock any notion of divine benevolence. When he saw Margaret, saw her suffering, he asked quietly if she wanted him to pray with her. She nodded weakly, and he knelt beside her on the debris-strewn floor. He began to speak in English, his voice soft but clear, offering prayers for peace and mercy. James translated what he could, converting David's Baptist theology into words Margareta could understand, bridging the linguistic and cultural gap with improvised translation that aimed for spirit rather than precision. Private Robert Hayes from Louisiana, a man who had worked as a carpenter before the conflict and who had hands scarred from years of working with wood and tools, arrived carrying water. He had somehow found a relatively clean container and had filled it from a pump that still functioned somewhere in the town. He offered it to James and Eugene, understanding that they would need supplies for their vigil. He said nothing, but his eyes conveyed respect for what they were doing. Sergeant William Bradford from Pennsylvania, who had been a schoolteacher like Margaret before being drafted, stood apart from the others, watching. William was a thoughtful man who often spent his rare, free moments writing in a journal, documenting his experiences with the hope that someday they might help others understand what this time had been like. He watched James and Eugene care for this dying German woman, and he understood that he was witnessing something that needed to be recorded, that would matter beyond this moment. More soldiers came. Some stayed only briefly, paying their respects and then returning to their duties. Others remained, creating a circle of witnesses around the central scene of caregiving. They represented a cross-section of the battalion, men from different platoons and specialties. There were tank crew members still wearing the distinctive tanker jackets. There were infantrymen attached to the battalion for various operations. There were support personnel, cooks and mechanics and drivers. What united them all beyond their shared military service and their shared racial identity was their recognition that something profound was occurring. They were watching one of their own choose to honor his oath over convenience, to see humanity where others might see only enemy. And in watching, they were choosing to affirm that choice, to stand as witnesses to it, to let their presence say, "This matters, what you are doing here matters." Lieutenant Morrison arrived after about 40 minutes, his face set in an expression that combined irritation with something more complex. Morrison was a career officer from Virginia, a white man who had commanded black troops throughout the conflict and who had developed complicated views about race and military service. He had grown up accepting segregation as natural and proper, but months of combat alongside black soldiers had challenged some of his assumptions. He had seen courage that could not be denied, had observed competence that could not be dismissed. He had come to order James to return to his duties, to enforce the regulations that governed military medicine. The words were prepared, the reprimand ready, but when he entered the room and saw the scene before him, something in his rigid military bearing softened. He saw James and Eugene working with quiet intensity. He saw Margaret, clearly dying, her face showing both pain and an unexpected peace. He saw the circle of black soldiers standing respectfully, their presence transforming a ruined room into something almost sacred. Morrison stood in the doorway, and for a long moment he did not speak. His training said one thing, his regulations demanded one thing, but his humanity, awakened perhaps by months of witnessing the best and worst of human nature, recognized something that transcended training and regulations. Finally, he made a decision that would be noted in his own record, and that would shape how history remembered his role in this story. He did not give the order he had come to deliver. Instead, he simply nodded to James, a gesture of acknowledgement and permission, and then he turned and left. When he wrote his report later that evening, he would note that Corporal McAllister had provided medical assistance to a critically wounded civilian, as time and resources permitted, fulfilling his duties with distinction. There would be no disciplinary action, no formal consequences for what, by strict interpretation, was a violation of priorities and chain of command. Margaret Fisher died as the late afternoon light filtered through the broken walls, casting long shadows across the rubble. Her last words, translated by James, were a message to her daughter, if anyone should ever find her, that she had tried to live according to her conscience, that she hoped her daughter would build a better world than the one being left behind. James closed her eyes and sat back, exhausted not from physical effort, but from the emotional weight of the past hours. Eugene placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of what they had shared. Lieutenant Morrison cleared his throat and spoke, his voice lacking its usual command tone. He said that he would note in his report that Corporal McAllister had provided medical assistance to a critically wounded civilian, as time and resources permitted, fulfilling his duty with distinction. There would be no disciplinary action. As they prepared to leave, James noticed that other soldiers had been quietly working while he attended to Margaret. They had gathered her few possessions, including the photograph of her family, and had arranged them respectfully beside her. Someone had even fashioned a crude cross from 2 pieces of wood and placed it nearby. Sergeant Chen approached James and said something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He said that James had reminded them all why they wore the uniform, that in a world that had lost its way, small acts of humanity were how you found it again. Word of what had happened spread through not only the 761st Tank Battalion, but to other units in the area. In the following days, as the American forces continued to advance and the full extent of the recent conflict's horrors became apparent through discoveries of concentration camps and mass graves, the story of a black medic who had stayed with a dying German woman became something of a legend. It became a story that soldiers told to remind themselves that they were different from what they were fighting against, that their cause, despite all the complexities and contradictions, stood for something fundamentally better. For the German civilians of Weimar, the story took on different significance. They had been told by their former government that the approaching forces would show them no mercy, that they should fear especially the black soldiers who would seek revenge. Instead, they had witnessed an act of profound compassion that challenged everything they had been led to believe. An elderly man named Ernst Hoffmann, who had been Margaret's neighbor, approached the American unit 3 days later. Through a translator, he asked to speak to the medic who had stayed with Frau Fischer. When James was brought forward, Hoffmann, with tears in his eyes, thanked him for giving her dignity in death. He said that the kindness shown by James had done more to defeat the poison of the former regime than any weapon could. Eugene Washington later wrote to his wife back in Alabama about the experience. In his letter, preserved now in the National Archives, he described the profound impact of those hours in the ruined building. He wrote that he had witnessed something that could not be taught, only lived, that the measure of a person was not found in their words or even their beliefs, but in their actions when no one was watching, when there was no reward for doing right and no penalty for walking away. The 761st Tank Battalion continued its advance through Germany until the conflict in Europe ended in May of 1945. They had traveled over 2,000 miles, from the beaches of France through the industrial heart of Germany. They had served with distinction in a military that remained segregated, proving their courage and capability in every engagement. James McAllister survived the conflict and returned to Philadelphia, where he used the benefits afforded to returning soldiers to attend medical school. He became a doctor like his father, opening a practice in a neighborhood that served both black and white patients at a time when such integration was still controversial. He rarely spoke about his experiences during the conflict, but those who knew him well said that something fundamental had been shaped by his time in service, particularly by one rainy afternoon in Weimar. In 1958, James received an unexpected letter from Switzerland. It was from Anna Fischer, Margaret's daughter, who had spent years searching for information about her mother's final days. Through various channels, and with the help of former soldiers who remembered the story, she had finally located the medic who had stayed with her mother. Anna wrote that learning of her mother's death had been devastating, but knowing that she had not died alone, that someone had cared enough to stay with her and provide comfort, had brought her peace. She asked James if she might visit him, to thank him in person and to learn more about those final hours. James agreed, and Anna Fischer traveled to Philadelphia that autumn. She met James and his wife, and over dinner he told her everything he could remember about her mother's last day. He gave her the photograph that someone had recovered from the rubble and that had somehow made its way back to him through military channels. He described her mother's courage, her concern for her children, her hope that the world would become better. Anna wept, but they were tears of gratitude as much as grief. She told James that her mother had written to her frequently before communications became impossible, and in those letters, Margaret had expressed her horror at what her country had become. She had tried, in her small way, to resist by teaching her students to think critically, to question propaganda, to value human dignity above political ideology. For this, she had been watched suspiciously by local authorities, but as a widow with children, she had been tolerated, barely. Before Anna returned to Switzerland, she gave James a small book that had belonged to her mother, a volume of poetry by Rainer Maria Rilke. Inside, Margareta had written an inscription years before, a quote from the poet. "Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses, who are only waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage." Anna told James that her mother had believed in the power of individual moral action, even when systems failed. She said that what James had done embodied exactly what her mother had tried to teach, that humanity persisted not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments when someone chose compassion over convenience. The book remained on James McAllister's desk for the rest of his life, a reminder of a day when the artificial divisions created by conflict had dissolved in the face of simple human decency. The story of James McAllister eventually became part of the historical record documenting the contributions of black soldiers during the Second World War. The 761st Tank Battalion itself was recognized for its service, having participated in the Battle of the Bulge and the final push into Germany. But for many who studied this history, the most significant legacy was not found in the battles fought, but in moments like the one in Weimar, where soldiers who had every reason to turn away instead chose to affirm the value of every human life. In 1997, 52 years after that April afternoon, the town of Weimar dedicated a small memorial in what had been Schillerstrasse. The memorial honored Margaret Fischer and other civilians who had perished in the final days of the conflict. At the dedication ceremony, attended by local officials and historians, special mention was made of the American medic who had stayed with Margaret, though his name had been lost to time in the German records. Anna Fischer, now in her 70s, attended the ceremony. She brought with her copies of correspondence between her family and James Macalister, who had passed away in 1989. She shared his story with those gathered, and a local historian undertook to research the 761st Tank Battalion and locate any surviving members who might remember Corporal Macalister. They found Eugene Washington, living in a veterans' home in Tennessee. Eugene, now in his mid-70s and in declining health, was interviewed about his service and specifically about that day in Weimar. His memory of the events remained sharp, and he spoke with deep respect about James Macalister's character and the difficult choice he had made. Eugene explained that what many people did not understand was the risk James had taken. By disobeying an indirect order to prioritize American casualties, by spending time and precious medical resources on an enemy civilian, James could have faced court-martial. The fact that Lieutenant Morrison had chosen not to pursue disciplinary action was itself remarkable, Eugene noted. It suggested that even hardened military officers could recognize when rules needed to bend before higher principles. Eugene also provided context that deepened understanding of James's choice. He revealed that just 2 days before the incident with Margareta Fisher, James had been unable to save a young soldier from their own unit, a private from New York who had bled out from wounds despite James's best efforts. The trauma of that loss, Eugene suggested, might have intensified James's determination to succeed where he could, to honor his oath even in circumstances where success meant only easing suffering rather than preserving life. This psychological dimension added nuance to the narrative. James Macalister had not been operating from abstract principle alone, but from the complex motivation of a healer who carried the weight of those he could not save, and who found redemption in acts of mercy wherever possible. The interviews with Eugene Washington were recorded and became part of an oral history project documenting the experiences of black soldiers in the conflict. These recordings now reside in the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, ensuring that stories like James Macalister's are not forgotten. In the broader context of racial integration in America, the actions of soldiers like James took on additional significance. The contrast was stark and painful. Black soldiers fought overseas for freedom while returning to a country where they faced segregation, discrimination, and often violence. The Double V campaign, Victory Abroad and Victory at Home, captured this tension. Stories of black soldiers acting with extraordinary humanity and courage became powerful ammunition in the civil rights struggles that would intensify in the following decades. James Macalister's choice in Weimar represented a living refutation of the racist ideologies that dehumanized people based on their identity. Here was a black man, deemed inferior by both his own country's laws and the German regime's propaganda, demonstrating moral clarity and compassion that transcended the hatred of the time. The irony would not have been lost on anyone paying attention. The supposedly inferior person acting with superior ethics. For the German people, particularly those who lived through the defeat and occupation, stories like this one played a complex role in reconstruction and reconciliation. The narrative of Americans as liberators was complicated by the reality of occupation, by the hardships that followed, by the division of their country. Yet individual stories of American soldiers showing humanity helped create space for relationship rather than permanent enmity. Margaret Fisher's death, witnessed and eased by James Macalister, became in microcosm what the post-conflict order attempted on a macro scale. The recognition that former enemies could find common ground in shared humanity, that the work of building peace required seeing beyond the categories of conflict. The scholarly analysis of such incidents has contributed to evolving understanding of moral behavior in extreme circumstances. Psychologists and ethicists have studied why some individuals, like James Macalister, make choices that defy tribal loyalty and risk personal cost to uphold universal principles. Research suggests that such individuals often come from backgrounds where moral education emphasized abstract principles over group allegiance, where role models demonstrated similar courage, and where personal identity centered on ethical commitments rather than external validation. James's upbringing in Philadelphia, with a father who treated all patients equally and who explicitly taught the primacy of the Hippocratic Oath, clearly shaped his decision-making framework. His choice in Weimar was not spontaneous improvisation, but the activation of deeply ingrained values under pressure. Interestingly, studies of rescuers during the Holocaust and other atrocities have identified similar patterns. People who risked their lives to save others typically did so not from dramatic moral agonizing, but from a sense that they could not do otherwise, that their core identity required the action. James's simple statement, "I took an oath," reflected this integration of principle and identity. The incident also illuminates the role of witnessing in moral action. Eugene Washington's choice to stay with James, and the subsequent gathering of other soldiers from the 761st, created a community of shared witness that reinforced the significance of what was happening. Their presence said, in effect, that this matters, that we recognize and affirm what is being done here. Lieutenant Morrison's decision not to intervene, and later not to pursue disciplinary action, represented another form of moral choice. Morrison could have insisted on protocol, could have made an example of James to maintain discipline. Instead, he allowed space for a higher law to operate, demonstrating that rigid adherence to rules is not always the most ethical path. His restraint, less dramatic than James's action, was nonetheless crucial in allowing the moment to unfold as it did. In the decades since the conflict, as the generation that fought it has gradually passed, the urgency of preserving such stories has intensified. The James McAllister story, among many others, reminds subsequent generations that history is not only about battles and treaties, statistics and strategies, but about individual human beings making choices under impossible circumstances, choices that reveal the best and worst of human capacity. For educators teaching about this period, such personal narratives provide entry points for students to connect emotionally with events that might otherwise seem distant and abstract. The image of a black medic staying with a dying German woman, their conversation bridging enemy lines through shared humanity, has pedagogical power that no recitation of casualty figures can match. The story also serves as a counter-narrative to simplified versions of the conflict that cast it purely in terms of good versus evil, liberators versus oppressed. While the regime James fought against was indeed evil in its ideology and actions, individual people within Germany had their own stories, their own moral struggles. Margarete Fischer, who had tried to teach students to think critically despite the pressures of propaganda, represented the complex reality that not all within a system share its beliefs. James's recognition of this complexity, his ability to see Margaret as an individual rather than merely as enemy, demonstrated moral sophistication that refused easy categorization. He could simultaneously oppose the regime that had started the conflict and offer compassion to one of its citizens. This nuanced moral vision is perhaps his most important legacy. In contemporary times, when conflicts continue to divide peoples and nations, when tribal identities often override common humanity, the story of James McAllister and Margarete Fischer offers a model of ethical clarity that transcends circumstances. It suggests that even in the midst of justified conflict, individual acts of mercy remain possible and necessary, that the categories of us and them need not be absolute, that the oath to heal or to do good can supersede other obligations. The memorial in Weimar, though modest, represents a small victory over historical amnesia. It ensures that Margarete Fischer is remembered not just as a casualty statistic, but as a person with a name, a history, and dignity. And through her remembrance, James McAllister is also honored, his choice validated across decades and cultures. Anna Fischer, before her own death in 2003, established a small scholarship fund in Weimar for students studying medicine, nursing, or related healing professions. The scholarship is awarded annually to students who demonstrate not only academic capability, but also commitment to serving all people, regardless of background. The first scholarship was awarded in James McAllister's name, and recipients are told his story as part of receiving the award. This living legacy extends the moment in that ruined apartment building into the future, creating ripples that touch lives James never knew. Young German medical students, learning about an American soldier who honored his oath 7 decades ago, carry forward the principle he exemplified. Some have gone on to work with Doctors Without Borders or similar organizations, providing care in conflict zones where they too must navigate the tension between political division and medical duty. The photograph that James returned to Anna Fisher, showing Margaret with her husband and children in happier times, now resides in a local historical museum in Weimar. Beside it is displayed a copy of James's service record, Eugene Washington's testimony, and letters between Anna and James. The exhibit is titled Humanity in Ruins, Moments of Mercy, in April 1945. Visitors to the exhibit, reading the materials and viewing the photograph, are confronted with the human cost of conflict in its most personal dimension. They see a woman who was once young and hopeful, who raised children and taught students, who watched her world descend into darkness and who died in the rubble of her own home. And they learn of a young medic who saw past all the reasons he might have walked away and instead chose to stay, offering comfort that transcended every boundary the world had constructed. The exhibit includes a final panel with a quote from James McAllister, taken from an interview he gave late in life to a local Philadelphia newspaper. Asked why he had made the choice he did, he gave an answer that captured his philosophy simply: "We spend so much time finding reasons to separate ourselves from each other, to say this person matters less than that person. But suffering doesn't recognize those boundaries. Pain is pain, fear is fear, and we either respond to it with compassion or we don't. That day I chose to respond. It's as simple and as complicated as that." The simplicity of his statement belies the profound moral weight of his action, but perhaps that is appropriate. Great moral acts often come from straightforward principles applied with courage. James McAllister was not a philosopher or a saint, just a medic who took his oath seriously and who possessed the strength to act on his convictions when it would have been easier not to. His legacy and the legacy of that April afternoon in Weimar reminds us that history is shaped not only by leaders and armies, but by individual choices made in obscure places, by people whose names might otherwise be forgotten, but whose actions ripple forward, changing the world in ways both small and profound. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.